Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin. Story 1. Iron Dreams in the Dunes, the birth of the Trans-Saharan Railway. You are standing in the middle of an endless, golden silence. The Sahara stretches in every direction, indifferent, patient. And then, there's a sound you did not expect to hear. The ring of hammers, the scrape of shovels, the faint echo of iron meeting iron. In the late 19th century, amid colonial ambition and dreams of industrial conquest, the French government conceived of something grand and ultimately futile, a railway across the Sahara Desert. This was not a dream of explorers or madmen, though it sometimes seemed both, but a policy, deliberated in offices in Paris by men who had never seen sand. The Trans-Saharan Railway was not just a train line. It was, as documents of the time dryly put it, a means of uniting Algeria with French West Africa through a corridor of logistics and influence. It promised to bind two vast territories into one continuous colonial machine. In theory, it would run from Algiers to the Niger River, threading across some of the harshest, most desolate terrain on Earth. The initial idea dates to 1879, when General Charles de Freycinet, then Minister of Public Works, included it in his plan for expanding France's railway network. This, like so many things from that era, was a fantasy of modernity imposed onto a resistant reality. Bureaucracy and blueprints. The dream of a railway began on paper, meticulously, quietly. Entire departments were created to oversee it. Le Service des Chemins de Fer Transsahariens was founded in 1880, complete with inkwells, ledgers, and a growing collection of increasingly outdated maps. Engineers, many just out of École Polytechnique, were dispatched into the interior with notebooks and sketching tools. Most of them got sick. A few never returned. Surveys were taken by camel. Sandstorms erased the stakes they drove into the ground. The surveyors noted, often in dry understatement, that progress was slow and measurements were challenging due to poor visibility and a shifting landscape. And yet, for every eroded mark, a new set of drawings would arrive in Paris. These featured idealistic straight lines. They never bent for mountains or dunes. The French planners thought the desert could be reasoned with, that it would be polite enough to accommodate their aspirations. The engineering challenge of emptiness. One of the least discussed but most important challenges in building the Trans-Saharan Railway was the complete absence of natural resources. There were no trees to cut for sleepers, no water for steam engines, no coal to feed furnaces, not even stones in some regions to anchor the track. And still it began. The initial test line was constructed between Biskra and Taugert in 1902. The French government called it a pilot segment, meant to study the feasibility of desert rail operations. It became the subject of hundreds of dry memos. The track was laid not on bedrock, but on sand, stabilized with imported gravel and hand-placed mats of woven palm leaves. It buckled regularly under its own weight and had to be dug out after every storm. Stations were placed every 30 kilometers, not because they were needed, but because the crews needed shade and water. These outposts were built in a uniform style, square, low-roofed buildings with thick mud brick walls and water tanks that had to be filled by ox-drawn carts. It was not practical, but it was deliberate. The colonial rationale. So why do it? Why build a railway across a lifeless wasteland? Because to the colonial mind, maps were promises, and empty spaces on maps were opportunities. The French had an enduring fear that Britain might claim Central Africa before them. A railway was not merely transportation, it was proof of possession. To build the line was to manifest control, to claim dominion over not only the land but the idea of the land. Railways had become symbols of civilization. They turned uncivilized land into connected, productive territory, or so the theory went. Every iron rail was a metaphor, and every station a tiny embassy of empire. Yet the reality was far more tedious. The railway's progress was slow. It consumed thousands of tons of imported steel, timber, and machinery, none of which came from the Sahara itself. The locals, understandably, viewed it with confusion and suspicion. Some Tuareg tribes saw the tracks as lines of fire that would bring destruction. Others simply ignored them. The French, undeterred, documented everything. They compiled logbooks about sand grain sizes and humidity levels, sleeping habits of the laborers, and the speed at which camels could carry iron bolts. The people of the project. Little is remembered of the workers who physically built the Trans-Saharan Railway. They were a mix of local conscripts, colonial troops, prisoners, and hired laborers from across North Africa. They toiled in unbearable heat, with minimal water, for months at a time. They slept in canvas tents that shredded in the wind. Many suffered from heat stroke, eye infections, and sand-related injuries. The medical staff noted cases of men developing temporary blindness from sun glare reflecting off the tracks. Even gloves, sent from France, were found to be useless, too thick, too hot. There were no shade trees, no sources of respite, and little recreation. Letters from the engineers frequently note the profound boredom and loneliness of the work. One young officer wrote in his journal, "We wait for shipments, we wait for mail, we wait for the train that is too often delayed. But most of all, we wait for a reason." That phrase was underlined in blue pencil. It would be the only thing underlined in the entire notebook. Steel lines to the horizon. By 1914, the Biskra-Taugert line had been extended to El Oud, and plans were underway to push deeper, toward the Saharan heartland and ultimately to Gao, on the Niger River. But then the world changed. Europe descended into World War I. France's attention and funding were diverted. Engineers were conscripted, supplies dwindled, the desert took over. Trains stopped running regularly, sand reclaimed the tracks, outposts emptied, and in the archives a final memo from 1916 recorded. Operations suspended until further notice. The railway has entered a state of dormancy. No more tracks would be laid that year, or the next, or the one after that. But that memo did not mark the end of the Trans-Saharan dream. It simply marked a pause, a breath, a quiet moment before someone somewhere tried again to chase the mirage with steel. But why did the French return again and again to a railway no one seemed to want, in a desert that could not support it? The First World War had ended, but the heat in the desert did not. The railway sat still, a skeleton of colonial ambition, half swallowed by wind-blown dunes. Yet in the smoky cafes of Paris and the quiet halls of the French Ministry of Colonies, the Trans-Saharan Railway refused to die. Like so many ideas born in committee meetings and sustained by pride, the railway lived on not in tracks or locomotives, but in paperwork. Rebirth on paper. By 1922, French control over its African colonies had grown, not shrunk. The old justification for the Trans-Saharan line, the desire to link Algeria with French West Africa, was again fashionable. A new generation of policymakers, too young to remember the project's failure, took up the cause with fresh ink. They spoke of economic corridors, civilizing missions, and integrated colonial development. But the reality remained unchanged. A railway in the Sahara would be expensive, slow, and strategically questionable. Even the numbers betrayed it. A 1923 report estimated that every kilometer of rail laid past Hassy-Messaud would cost 5 times as much as an equivalent segment in France. Still, planning resumed. Engineers were sent again into the desert, this time with motor lorries and mechanized drills. A few even carried portable radios, which rarely worked. They resurveyed the same terrain their predecessors had once trudged across by camel. Some even noted the remains of wooden stakes from 40 years before, sticking up like splinters from the sand. The problem of nothing. One of the greatest challenges in pushing the railway deeper into the Sahara was not resistance, but emptiness. There were no obstacles to overcome because there was almost nothing at all. No villages to serve, no agricultural zones to connect, no hills to tunnel through or valleys to bridge. Only the monotony of flat terrain, unpredictable sand, and occasional salt flats. Engineers referred to it as the problem of nothing. The line from Taugert to Ouagle, a minor extension, was finally completed in 1924, but it lacked regular traffic. Freight trains ran infrequently. Mail often arrived by truck instead. Stations were manned, but their daily reports read like weather logs. 2 lizards seen, wind from the west, train delayed, no cargo, no incidents. Some colonial officials argued that the line should proceed no further until demand could be proven. But others, more ambitious or perhaps more stubborn, pressed on. The railway would not be built on need, it would create the need. That idea, too, was a mirage. Building the line with forgotten hands. Labor continued under the harshest conditions. The work camps for track-laying crews, many of them local Berber and Arab conscripts, prisoners, or Senegalese tirailleurs, were sited in the only locations with semi-reliable water wells. These became de facto villages, filled with the sounds of coughing, arguments, and boots stomping on gravel. The French administration kept detailed logs on every worker: age, origin, discipline history, medical records. Most of these men were paid in rations, and they worked long hours in 45 degrees C heat. It was said the only thing colder than the desert nights were the instructions from Paris. One engineer, Louis-Baptiste Rieny, kept a quiet diary. He described his days without flair. Laid 30 meters of track, lunch of dates and biscuits, saw a man cry today, no letters from home. His entries offer no drama, just the slow passage of time, like sand drifting over a shovel. Still, Rieny remained for 4 years, from 1926 to 1930. He died in Marseille, long after the project was shelved, having seen the rails stretch less than 200 kilometers further in his lifetime. Camels versus locomotives. One of the more absurd challenges the railway faced was that it could not outcompete the camel. Camel caravans had operated across the Sahara for over 1,000 years. They were slow, yes, but reliable, cheap, and adaptable. They required no fuel, little infrastructure, and they knew how to survive in the desert far better than any machine. More importantly, camels went where the people were, not just where tracks could be laid. Traders who once feared being replaced by the train now found themselves unbothered. In fact, some railway stations became new hubs for camel caravans. The goods arrived by rail: salt, textiles, canned food, and were loaded onto camelback to be taken deep into the desert where trains would never go. An internal colonial report from 1929 conceded, "The railway has become a supplier to the caravans rather than their successor." The irony was not lost on local populations, many of whom took satisfaction in watching the mechanical colossus serve the animal it was meant to obsolete. A station for nobody. Perhaps the most symbolic folly of the Trans-Saharan Railway was the station at Insala. Built with great expense in 1932, it included a long platform, storage buildings, a telegraph office, and quarters for 6 station attendants. But the train never came. The station was built years ahead of the projected line, on the assumption that progress would catch up to it. It never did. For over a decade, the outpost sat unused. Locals called it the waiting house. It became a shelter for windstorms and an occasional meeting place for camel herders, but no passenger ever bought a ticket there. And yet reports were filed. Maintenance logs were submitted monthly. Supplies were delivered. A generator was installed. One of the station masters, Henry Dubois, allegedly kept the telegraph line active for 7 years, even though no one was on the other end. This dedication to process over purpose became a hallmark of the entire project. The railway was always in progress, always a little further than before, always almost useful. In 1935, the station at Insala was closed. The doors were locked and the key was mailed to Algiers. No one remembers where it ended up. A brief glimmer before the fall. Just as the project approached its greatest extent, reaching near a drawer, something unexpected happened. A global economic depression, followed by the slow build-up to another world war. Funding disappeared. Machinery rusted. Laborers were conscripted or dismissed. And in 1939, the final shipment of rails destined for the Sahara was quietly redirected to European stockpiles. The railway had reached nearly 1,300 kilometers into the desert. It was impressive on paper, but it fell short by more than 800 kilometers from its intended connection with West Africa. It had reached no major trading centers, enabled no transformative change, and carried almost no meaningful freight. Still, the dream refused to die. There were whispers, as late as 1946, that the Americans might fund the project as part of post-war development. Some argued the line could serve as a Cold War supply route. Others suggested it be converted into a highway instead, a more flexible artery through the sands. But even these ideas faded, one by one, buried under new priorities and old skepticism. Yet one might wonder, why was the railway not simply abandoned earlier? What force kept it alive for over 60 years? There is a kind of persistence that borders on delusion, a belief held not because it works, but because to admit failure would unravel too much. The Trans-Saharan Railway by the mid-20th century had become just that, a relic of bureaucratic faith, kept alive by inertia, sunk costs, and the echo of old imperial dreams. By 1950, parts of the line still operated sporadically. Trains ran from Biskra to Taugert, and sometimes farther into the desert if fuel, crew, and weather permitted. These were mostly symbolic journeys. Cargo was light, passengers rare, but reports were still filed, coal still burned, and engines still chugged, if only to maintain the illusion that the project had not been a mistake. The mirage becomes a myth. What had once been a grand vision was now a story told with a shrug. Young engineers assigned to the Saharan line saw it as a punishment post. The better minds went north, to the growing networks near Oran and Algiers. Those sent south often left engineering for administration, or left altogether. Still, the French government insisted that the line be maintained in anticipation of resumed development. Files continued to circulate with titles like Strategic Desert Link and Preliminary Survey for Sub-Saharan Extension, though many were just rewrites of older reports, some unchanged from the 1920s. In local folklore, the railway took on a different meaning. Among some Tuareg communities, it was called the Snake of Steel, a creature that appeared in the desert and never moved far. Others believed it had been built to carry a single load that never came, or that it was a path for ghosts. There were even rumors that a fully loaded train had once disappeared into a sandstorm, its bones still buried beneath dunes. These stories were not based in fact, but they were not far from the truth either. In 1953, an engine derailed near Hassi Bel Geber, and the wreckage was never recovered. It had been pulling empty cars. The mechanics of futility. The locomotives used on the line were Type 140C steam engines, designed for temperate climates. In the Sahara, their boilers cracked from rapid cooling. Their wheels overheated on sand-strewn rails, and their water tanks evaporated faster than they could be filled. Crews developed workarounds. They traveled at night, kept spare water in canvas bladders, and learned to adjust pressure gauges by intuition rather than numbers. The maintenance logs from this period are oddly poetic, filled with phrases like, "The locomotive breathes poorly today. We changed the fire brick, but it still complains." Repairs were improvised. Spare parts came by convoy, sometimes months late. A single broken axle could halt operations for a week. And yet, there was no serious effort to modernize the system, not because it couldn't be done, but because no one believed the railway would ever fulfill its purpose. It had become an obligation, not an opportunity. Independence and the death knell. When Algeria's war for independence began in 1954, the railway was already on life support. The French military made limited use of it for supply routes in the north, but the southern lines remained peripheral, too slow, too vulnerable, and too disconnected. After Algeria achieved independence in 1962, the new government inherited the railway system, including the dusty veins of the Trans-Saharan project. But it had little interest in the desert-bound portions. National priorities had shifted: industry, education, housing, none of which would be served by sending trains into the sands. Sections of the railway were formally decommissioned between 1964 and 1969. The tracks were not always removed, too expensive, too remote. They were simply abandoned. Stations were boarded up, machinery left to rust. Railcars became shelters for animals. One outpost near in Aminas was taken over by date farmers who used the station's roof to dry fruit. By the 1970s, satellite images showed the once straight tracks bowed, buried, broken, a metallic scar across the face of the Sahara. The line that became a road. Interestingly, a portion of the proposed railway path was later repurposed not for trains, but for roads. The Trans-Saharan Highway, begun in the 1970s, followed a strikingly similar path to the original rail vision: Algiers through Tamanrasset and southward to Niger and Nigeria. Built with international funding and paved in segments, the highway succeeded where the railway failed. It required fewer fixed installations, adapted better to shifting populations, and could accommodate trucks, cars, even bicycles. Ironically, the success of the road highlighted just how mismatched the railway had been for its environment. The desert demanded flexibility. Trains were rigid. A French transport official, in a quiet admission during a 1981 conference, said, "The desert prefers tires." Echoes in the present. Today, the remains of the Trans-Saharan Railway still exist, though barely. In Taugert, the station still stands, its signage faded, its benches covered in dust. A few tourist trains run on holidays, more for nostalgia than utility. At the old outposts, there are stories, faint memories passed down by families who once lived by the tracks. Children play on abandoned flat cars. Dogs sleep in the shade of rusted water towers. Somewhere near El Golia, a signal lamp still swings in the wind. The Algerian government has, on occasion, floated ideas of reviving the line as part of a Pan-African trade route, but none have materialized. The cost is too great, the terrain too harsh, and the history too instructive. The desert is full of traces: footprints, cart tracks, caravan trails, bones. The railway joined them. Final reflections: what endures? So what do we make of it, the Trans-Saharan Railway? A project that consumed generations, money, sweat, and steel, and delivered so little. Perhaps it teaches us that infrastructure is not just about movement, but about intention. That building something doesn't guarantee its use. That a line on a map is not the same as a connection in real life. It shows the power of bureaucratic dreams and the danger of mistaking vision for viability. The railway was never truly about transport. It was about presence. It said, We are here, we control this, we will stay. But the desert has its own language. It waits, it erases, it reminds us that permanence is often a mirage. And so, in the soft silence of the Sahara, where once the shrill whistle of a French locomotive echoed against rock and dune, all that remains is the faint memory of iron dreams and the quiet question: how many other grand designs lie buried beneath the sand, not because they were impossible, but because they never truly listened to the land? Story 2: Stone Sleepers, the colonial engineers who waited for rain. The desert has never cared much for permanence. Yet in the early 20th century, colonial France insisted otherwise. In the far reaches of southern Algeria and northern Mali, dozens of stone and mud brick outposts were built not as forts or garrisons but as railway infrastructure. Signal towers, engine houses, tool depots. Stone by stone, they were laid down in dry riverbeds, under the full assumption that water would eventually come. These buildings were constructed for rain-fed expansion, a fantasy that, like the railway itself, never truly arrived. And so, the men who built them waited. They were called les dormeurs de pierre, the stone sleepers, not because they slept on stone, but because they were builders of stillness, men tasked with constructing durable buildings for an impermanent railway. They knew the tracks might never come, the water might never flow, and the goods might never arrive, but they built anyway. The ideology of infrastructure. By 1919, after the first stretches of the Trans-Saharan Railway had proven underwhelming in both use and profitability, French colonial planners reoriented their focus. If the trains were not arriving quickly, they reasoned the stations must arrive first. Build the facilities, build the environment, and the traffic would follow. This belief was not entirely irrational. Railways often do stimulate development. But in the case of the Sahara, it was built on flawed assumptions about geography, rainfall, and settlement patterns. Colonial engineers, most notably Jules Renaud, devised a series of auxiliary stations, meant to serve future population centers and storage nodes. These were constructed even in areas with no tracks, no roads, and no local populations, only the idea that someday water might support life there. Some of these were sited near wadis, seasonal riverbeds that carried water a few times a year, if that. Renaud believed these could become oases with proper damming and cultivation. The stations were meant to be the skeletal system of an economy yet to be born. In his 1920 engineering brief, Renaud wrote, "The railway is not only a system of movement, it is a system of hope. We must begin not where the trains are, but where the people may someday be." The phrase was elegant, the reality less so. Building without purpose. Between 1920 and 1934, over 40 stone structures were erected along the projected southern routes of the Trans-Saharan Railway. Their designs were standardized square or rectangular buildings with thick limestone or adobe walls, small windows to minimize heat gain, and high ceilings for airflow. Most included a water tank, a tool shed, and a single office. Materials were hauled in by camel, ox cart, or truck when available. In the dry season, construction stalled due to lack of shade and hydration. In the wet season, brief as it was, floodwaters sometimes undermined the foundations of buildings that had just been completed. The builders were often Senegalese soldiers and Algerian laborers, overseen by French officers with engineering degrees and little desert experience. They worked long shifts with no machinery, mixing clay and sand with their feet, stacking stones under a sun that offered no forgiveness. Many of the workers fell ill. Others simply walked away, unable to see the purpose of the labor, yet others remained out of duty or inertia. One outpost built near the dry wadi at Amgwid took 18 months to finish. It was never used. A year after its completion, a passing sandstorm partially buried it. A decade later, aerial surveys couldn't locate it at all. The engineers lives. The engineers assigned to these stations men like Emile Vachon, Henry Merchel, and Georges Duport lived quiet, isolated lives. Their days were filled with measurements, ledgers, and letters to distant offices. Each man was responsible for multiple sites, often miles apart, connected only by unreliable convoys and the occasional camel train. They kept meticulous journals. Vachon's entries are some of the few surviving personal accounts of the period. He wrote, "I checked the bricks at station number 9, still sound. No cracks, no signs of life. I sweep the sand out of the office though no one has entered in months. I eat boiled millet. I write this. The sun has not moved in hours." He was 27 years old at the time. These engineers were not adventurers. They were functionaries with pens and rules bound to imperial logic. Many had no real choice in their posting. Some came to like the desert, others grew bitter. But they all shared one task, to make permanence out of nothing. Why wait for rain? The waiting was not just metaphorical. Some of the station designs explicitly assumed that seasonal rains would support agriculture. Small silos and storage rooms were included in the layouts for grain stockpiles that never materialized. Wells were dug in dry soil, capped and sealed, in the belief that aquifers might later be tapped. This logic wasn't entirely unique. Across the empire, similar hopeful infrastructure was built in Madagascar, Indochina, and French West Africa. But in the Sahara, the optimism was particularly misplaced. Rainfall was measured in millimeters per year and often skipped entire seasons. Still, the stations remained. They were rarely staffed. Occasionally, a traveling surveyor would sleep there for a night, jotting in his logbook and leaving behind cigarette butts and sand. When the rare rains did come, they often washed out the roads and cut off communication. Ironically, the very rainfall the engineers had hoped for became the reason they could not return. Stations with no name. Many of these structures were never formally recorded in French maps. They became ghost stations, unmarked, unlabeled, and forgotten. Some were given code numbers S14, S27 in internal memos. Others were identified by coordinates scribbled in marginalia. Satellite surveys in the 2000s have rediscovered some of them. Crumbling walls, roofless shells, floors still tiled in hexagonal patterns. One such site, now called Poste Renaud by locals, contains an intact door frame and rusted hinges. No train has ever passed within 100 kilometers of it. Today, Tuareg herders sometimes use these ruins for shade. Some graffiti them. Others paint symbols of protection on the walls, believing they shelter jinn. A few have been incorporated into makeshift homesteads. And yet the original builders would be astonished to know that these stations have outlasted the railway they were built to support. But the question remains, what kept the engineers there in the heat, building stone for trains that never came, and when did they finally give up? The sun never blinked. It was always there, an unjudging witness to the quiet futility of stone buildings rising from dust. By the mid-1930s, the outposts of the Trans-Saharan Railway's auxiliary stations had multiplied, not in purpose, but in number. Still, the engineers stayed. And they waited. Not one of them truly believed the rain would come in the way the planners in Paris envisioned, but belief had little to do with it. Orders did. The railway had entered a phase of philosophical inertia, progress without meaning, structure without function. The engineers had become cartographers of potential, drawing lines in a land that did not want them. A life measured in memos. Inside these lonely stone stations, life was dominated by routine. Most engineers worked alone or with a single assistant, sometimes a local interpreter, sometimes a conscripted helper. They received supply shipments once a month when the sand permitted and were instructed to file reports weekly. These reports were meticulously structured, building status, weather data, signs of erosion, pest activity, any wildlife observed, and notes on local engagement. Many weeks, there was nothing to report, so they reported the nothing. One such memo, filed from Station S-22 in 1937 by a Lieutenant E. Gauthier, reads, "All structures intact. Temperature peaked at 43 degrees C. Observed 3 beetles near tool shed. Water level unchanged. No visitors, no disturbances. End of report." The French colonial bureaucracy cherished these memos. They filled boxes, which filled offices, which filled basements. Few were ever read, but they served a purpose not in governance but in presence. A station that filed a report was still alive, even if it served no function. This is how an empire sustains itself not only through conquest, but through the illusion of order. The desert teaches a slow lesson. The Sahara, of course, offered its own commentary. Every few years, a freak storm would hit. Rains would pour violently for a day or two, flooding wadis and washing out roads. The stations would become islands of mud. Engineers would dig trenches for runoff, and then just as quickly the water would vanish. But in those moments there was hope. The architects in Paris would seize on rainfall data to argue that seasonal hydrology supported future settlement. New plans were drawn, more stations proposed, supplies ordered. And then the desert dried again, the soil cracked, the air hardened, the hope evaporated. Many engineers came to see this pattern not as frustrating but soothing. The desert revealed, over time, a kind of honesty absent from colonial policy. In a letter home dated 1938, an engineer named Albert Durand wrote, "Out here everything unnecessary disappears. The sand takes it. Only what matters remains. I wonder if Paris is as efficient." Durand stayed at his post until 1941. The stations that became villages, almost. There were brief periods where the dream seemed almost plausible. In the late 1930s, encouraged by a stretch of favorable rainfall, the French launched a pilot project to settle families near a handful of stations. The idea was to create proto-rail communities, villages that would eventually justify the tracks. 3 sites were chosen: Tagheza, Titicolt, and Amgwid. At each site, roughly 20-30 Algerian or Malian families were relocated and provided with seed supplies, goats, and basic irrigation equipment. The railway stations were to serve as distribution centers. The engineers were instructed to assist with agricultural layout. Initial reports were optimistic. Crops sprouted millet, lentils, and dates. Children played in the shade of engine sheds. Station logs showed actual transactions: food received, tools loaned, repairs made. But then inevitably the rain stopped. The wells dried. The families moved away. By 1940, all 3 proto-villages had been abandoned. Their only legacy was a series of black and white photographs showing children lined up in front of French-built buildings, with captions like, "The future of the desert." But the future had already left. Bureaucracy in the absence of purpose. Still, the administrative machine refused to quit. More buildings were proposed. Maps were drawn. There were meetings held in Algiers and Paris to discuss strategies for desert urbanization. Architects argued over the orientation of unused doors. Clerks compared rainfall averages from 1923 and 1938 with great seriousness. What they didn't do was visit the sites. A now famous letter, sent in 1942 from engineer Henry Louville to the Colonial Works Directorate, reads, "Sirs, I write to request clarification. Am I building infrastructure for a railway, or am I maintaining ruins for posterity? At present, the answer appears to be both." He received no reply. Instead, he received a new shipment of window shutters. Louville would later resign, but his question would echo for decades. When does a project become a monument to its own failure? The long silence of war. With the outbreak of World War II, priorities shifted. The Trans-Saharan Railway and all its associated construction was declared strategically irrelevant by French military command. Supplies stopped, mail dwindled, engineers were recalled or reassigned. A few stayed behind. Whether from personal attachment, bureaucratic error, or sheer indifference, they remained in their stone buildings, filling out reports that would never be read. One such man, Emile Petit, reportedly stayed at Station 31 until 1945. He received no orders, no updates. He kept a handwritten log that included recipes, wind directions, and philosophical musings. He once wrote, "I think the sand knows we are trying to hold it still. It resents that, and so it moves." When he finally left, he buried the logbook in a tin box behind the station. It was found by a geographer in 1987, after the engineers left. After the war, few efforts were made to reclaim or repurpose the stone stations. The newly forming governments of post-colonial Africa had other priorities. The desert stations were reminders of imperial folly, and many were left to erode. Some became navigational landmarks for Tuareg and Arab caravans. Others became graffiti canvases, their walls inscribed with verses, slogans, or names of loved ones lost in the sands. In the 1970s, during a brief resurgence of Saharan interest tied to uranium exploration, a handful of stations were surveyed for potential reuse. Engineers noted that many were structurally sound, despite decades of exposure. Yet no trains ever came. The desert, patient as ever, resumed its work. Now, as these stone buildings stand silent under a century of sun, one has to wonder, were the engineers building for the future, or were they burying the past? Long after the engineers had packed their ledgers and left, and long after France itself had abandoned its Saharan illusions, the stone sleepers remained, baked by decades of sun, battered by sandstorms, but stubbornly upright. They were ruins from the start, built not for people, but for plans, ideas projected into the desert like shadows without substance. And yet they endured, more than the tracks, more than the trains, even more than the names of the men who built them. The stone sleepers outlived the railway. After empire, the post-colonial silence. Following Algeria's independence in 1962, the newly formed government inherited a handful of buildings in the desert that no longer had a clear purpose. Many were never officially catalogued. Some were dismantled for materials. Others were quietly absorbed into desert communities used as storage for water tanks, as rest stops for long-distance traders, or simply as shelters. Most were left untouched. By the 1970s, only a few remained visible on updated maps. French archives in Algiers contained detailed plans for stations that had never existed in reality, while actual, solid buildings stood anonymously in the sand. A researcher from the University of Tamanrasset, Dr. Karim Bouzid, wrote in 1981, "These stations are tombstones for a colonial dream. Their silence speaks louder than any locomotive ever did." And indeed, silence became their defining quality. The wind moved through open windows. Lizards curled up in the shade of surveyors' tables. The sound of hammers and shovels had long since faded, replaced by drifting sand and the occasional rustle of date palm leaves in the distance. But that was not the end of their story. Rediscovery, archaeologists of the absurd. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a new wave of interest swept through the region, not from railway planners, but from historians and anthropologists. Armed with GPS equipment, satellite imagery, and declassified French military maps, researchers began to systematically locate and document the forgotten stations. The project was never widely publicized, but it became a quiet obsession among a small circle of scholars who saw the outposts as unintended monuments to imperial overreach. Among them was Dr. Isabelle Marteau, a Franco-Algerian historian who spent 10 years tracking the old stone sleepers. Her field notes, later published under the title Outposts of Absence, offer a haunting perspective. The stations are not sad, they do not mourn their purpose, they simply are, built well, forgotten quickly. They were never allowed to be useful, and so they became timeless. She and her team cataloged over 30 remaining structures, many in surprisingly good condition. Doors missing, roofs damaged, but walls intact. Shadow lines from the original blueprint still visible on the plaster in some rooms. One station still had a wooden chair bolted to the floor. Another bore the initials, JR 1932, carved into a beam. In a few, the original engineering manuals had survived, pages curled but legible. Mardo's team took nothing. They believed the silence of these buildings was part of their integrity. Uses unexpected, purposes reborn. While scholars studied the buildings as relics, local communities slowly adapted some of them for more practical use. In the village of In Eker, a former rail station now serves as a schoolhouse, its thick stone walls providing insulation against both heat and cold. The blackboard is painted directly over the original blueprint sketch of the railway spur line. In another location near Ayulef, a partially collapsed outpost was rebuilt using traditional mud brick techniques and now houses a women's weaving collective. The looms rest where telegraph machines once sat. These uses were never planned, but they represent the most enduring success of the project. The buildings outlived their empire. They were repurposed not by imperial design, but by necessity and adaptation. The engineers remembered. Of the dozens of engineers who worked on the stone sleepers, few are remembered. Most left no legacy. Their names exist only in brittle letters, in water-stained logbooks, in footnotes to dusty memos. But traces remain. Henry Merchel's station at Tidicult still has his name scratched into the plaster wall. A schoolteacher uses it to teach cursive script. Emile Vachon's journal, recovered in 1972, now sits in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Algiers, its pages filled with quiet, almost poetic entries. No mail today, no sound today, the air holds its breath here. Perhaps that is what remains most remarkable, the humanity buried in a project so bureaucratic, so deeply impersonal. These men were not architects of conquest. They were its instruments, but in their solitude, many became accidental chroniclers of a forgotten effort to shape the unshapable. Legacy in absence. Unlike grand cathedrals or majestic city halls, these buildings were never intended as symbols. They were meant to serve a schedule, not a soul. And yet, they now stand as eloquent reminders of the disconnection between planning and reality. In their emptiness, they remind us that history is often made of attempts, not accomplishments. The effort to build the Trans-Saharan Railway and the stations to support it was not simply a logistical failure. It was a philosophical one. To build without need. To wait for rain that does not come. To impose a system upon a place that had already figured out how to survive without it. Reflection, the meaning of what remains. And so we return to the question, what were these stations? Infrastructure, symbols, ruins. Perhaps the best answer is the simplest. They were shelters. For tools, for people, for ideas. Even today they shelter memory. They are not majestic, they were never meant to be, but they are real. In a world obsessed with speed, with progress, with innovation, the stone sleepers remind us that stillness has its place. That the desire to control the landscape is not always rewarded. And that sometimes, the most enduring things are not the ones that succeed, but the ones that survive. So next time you see a forgotten wall in the desert, standing alone against the sky, remember. It may have been built for a train, but it stands now for everything that refused to move. Story 3. The Sand-Stuffed Journals of Lieutenant Pickwart. Lieutenant Andre Pickwirt was not a famous man. You won't find him in textbooks, nor in the indexes of colonial military histories. He was not a general or a governor. He was a minor logistics officer in the French Sahara Corps during the 1920s, stationed for years in places whose names changed with the shifting sands. But he wrote, not for publication, not for politics. He wrote because the wind wouldn't let him sleep. And now, 100 years later, his journals, sand-stuffed, brittle, their ink fatting, offer one of the most intimate, vivid, and dull portraits of life along the half-built trans-Saharan railway. Not the heroic life, not the ideological, the actual. This is the story of a man who tried to make sense of a senseless project, day by day, entry by entry, surrounded by heat, silence, and dust. A man of order. Lieutenant Pickwirt arrived at Hassi Messaoud Station in November 1922. He was 31, unmarried, educated in mathematics, and recently transferred from an administrative post in Algiers. The railway command had requested logistical support with clerical aptitude and patience. He was perfect for the role. His duties included verifying railway shipments, organizing rations for track workers, maintaining equipment inventories, recording rainfall when there was any. At first, he kept only official ledgers, but within 2 weeks, he began writing a personal log, separate from his duties. A private diary bound in goatskin, dated meticulously in the upper right corner of each page. December 2, 1922. No engine today. Heat sharp, even at 7 a.m. Sand infiltrated the flour sacks. The men brushed off what they could. The flour tastes like limestone now. The mechanic is coughing again. I asked if he's ill. He says he misses the sea. These were the first entries in what would become a 17-volume chronicle of colonial isolation, infrastructure, and inertia. An observer, not a believer. Pickwirt's writing was not dramatic. In fact, it was painfully slow, as if he were trying to mirror the pace of the desert itself. He wrote about the noise camels made when they chewed rope, how the same screwdriver had been used to fix both a typewriter and a steam valve, the difficulty of keeping ink from drying mid-sentence. January 11, 1923. The station clock has stopped. I wind it, it ticks, then stops. I have learned that many things in the desert briefly pretend to work before giving up. What made Pickwirt's journals special was not what they recorded, it was the way he recorded everything. He paid attention to things others ignored, and his boredom became a kind of archaeological act. Life in the margins. Each volume was crammed with maps traced by hand, annotated with comments like "no shade here" or "flies always worse after noon." Lists of which laborers arrived late and who had eaten all their tinned beans early. Notes on water use such as 4 men used 38 liters today, same as goats. He also cataloged absurdities. A wrench missing for weeks was found under a prayer rug. One station had 24 nails and no hammer. A train once arrived carrying 10 crates of uniforms, but no boots or food. March 7, 1923. A crate labeled glass lanterns contained wool socks. We are 42 degrees C. Nobody knows who requested these. The supply list refers to cold weather preparations. I have begun to doubt the existence of Algiers. These entries, while mundane, have since become a source of historical insight into the real workings of the railway, far more so than official French reports. The sounds of nothing. Perhaps most striking is how often Pickwirt wrote about sound, or the absence of it. April 9, 1923. At night I lie on my cot and hear the wires hum. There is no telegraph signal. It is just the metal singing to itself. June 3, 1923. A train passed today. The echo lasted longer than the engine. The men stopped working to listen. One said it reminded him of thunder, though he's never heard thunder. Sound for Pickford became a way of marking time. The clink of a dropped tool, the creak of wood warping in heat, these were as important as clock hands. When there was no train for weeks, he began to time his days by how often the flies landed on his ink bottle. Reflections in dust. Despite the dullness of his routine, Pickford's writing occasionally veered into reflection. Not dramatic critique, he was no rebel but a kind of worn-out realism. July 14, 1923. This is not a railway, really. It is a long argument with the sand. We say connect, and the desert replies, why? August 2, 1923. Sometimes I think the stations are only there to give men like me something to count. He never directly condemned the colonial system he worked for, but his entries increasingly questioned the logic of permanence in such a transient environment. He began calling the track sections tentative rails, as if they too might someday pack up and leave. Letters never sent. At the back of each volume, Pickford wrote unsent letters to family, to old friends, to no one in particular. These were never posted. Some were fragments. Some were entire pages, often intimate, occasionally bitter. Mother, you said I'd return with medals. I've earned none, only sand in my teeth. To the man who replaced me at the bureau, do not envy me. The sunsets here are a lie. They promise relief and deliver only tomorrow. To myself, 10 years from now, if you are reading this, I hope you are not counting water barrels anymore. These letters provide glimpses of a man slowly disintegrating into routine. Not tragically, not heroically, just inevitably. A journal buried in a trunk. Pickford remained at his post until 1929, longer than most officers in his position. When he returned to France, he brought his journals with him in a wooden trunk, wrapped in oilcloth. They were never published. He lived quietly in Poitiers, worked as a school inspector, and died in 1964. The journals were discovered decades later, in 1998, in an attic after his granddaughter passed away. The discovery sparked a small wave of academic interest. Several volumes were digitized by the Archives Coloniales Françaises, and select entries were published in a limited edition collection titled Sand, Ink, and Iron, The Writings of Lieutenant Pickford. The book received little attention, but among railway historians and colonial scholars, it became quietly celebrated as a masterpiece of boring but significant documentation. A voice left behind. Lieutenant Pickford never changed history. He didn't finish the railway. He didn't write grand theories. He simply paid attention, and in doing so, he captured something no blueprint or plan ever could. What it was like to serve a machine that never quite started, to live within a dream that everyone had stopped believing in but hadn't yet stopped building. His journals remind us that history is not made only by generals or revolutionaries. Sometimes it's written slowly, carefully by men who sit in hot rooms and count bolts. And sometimes it's those records that outlast the dream itself. But what became of the places he wrote about, those quiet stations, those missing wrenches, those humming wires? Do any of them remain, untouched, as forgotten echoes of the man who once wrote them into memory? Lieutenant Pickford's journals captured the small sounds of a large failure, but the places he documented, the half-built stations, the never-used signal sheds, the platforms that awaited a train that never came, did not vanish. Some still stand, others were swallowed by the desert. A generation after Pickford left, a few curious travelers and researchers set out with copies of his notebooks, tracing his faded words across a landscape where names had shifted and roads had turned to sand. What they found was not the railway itself, but the echoes of its attempt. The lost station at mile 217. In Volume 4 of Pickford's journals, there is a recurring mention of mile 217, a stone station located 2 days, camel ride south of Taugert. According to his notes, it was constructed in late 1923 and never officially commissioned. He called it the station without papers. October 19, 1923. We delivered hinges and paint. The painter did not arrive. The roof is on. The windows are not. I opened a can of peaches in the office today and listened to the desert scratch the shutters. The station had no assigned staff, no telegraph, and no timetable. Yet Pickwirt visited every few weeks to file a condition report and record the number of scorpions spotted in the engine shed. Decades later, in 2002, a team from the Institut de Recherche Saharian attempted to locate mile 217. Using GPS coordinates derived from Pickwirt's mapped sketches cross-referenced with colonial supply logs, they found a low, crumbling wall and a rusted hinge buried in sand. Nothing else remained. But they also found something stranger, a perfectly intact tin of preserved peaches, stamped 1922, sealed and upright on a stone shelf. The can was unopened. It now sits in a museum in Guardia, under glass labeled Mile 217 Artifact from the Pickwirt logs. The cartographer who followed footnotes. In 2010, a young Algerian geographer, Salim Haroun, published a small academic paper titled Remapping the Desert, Using Colonial Diaries to Locate Lost Infrastructure. In it, he documented how Pickwirt's journals allowed him to identify at least 6 undocumented stations, 3 of which had never appeared in official colonial maps. Haroun followed clues like descriptions of geological formations, a black rock like a sleeping dog due west, counts of footsteps, 684 paces from well to platform edge, moonrise timings relative to compass bearings. Haroun described the process as archaeological triangulation through boredom. In his words, most colonial documents were designed to glorify. Pickwirt's were designed to observe. That made them truthful even in their triviality. Using these methods, Haroun located a collapsed tool house near Amgwid, complete with a pile of bent nails, a station latrine built into a cliff face, still intact, a metal sign reading Défense de Passer, half buried in sand, though no tracks had ever reached it. These discoveries, while seemingly minor, have since become crucial evidence of the scale of the trans-Saharan effort and its failure. Pickwirt's people, remembering the workers. While Pickwirt's journals focused mostly on environment and logistics, scattered throughout are references to the men who worked under him: laborers, cooks, guards, and fellow officers. Some were only mentioned once. Emberk built the fire today. He adds too much salt to the lentils, but he sings in the evening. Others were recurring characters. Sergeant Rousseau, who organized chess tournaments using carved stones. Nasir the carpenter, who made a radio cabinet from old packing crates. Yasin, a water carrier who left suddenly, leaving behind his belt and a half-written letter. These fragments, while brief, are often the only known references to these men. They do not appear in French military rolls. Their surnames are lost, but Pickwirt, meticulous as always, recorded their voices. March 3, 1924. I asked Nasir why he bothers varnishing the door, given the dust. He said, "Because I built it, and I want it to shine even if no one sees it." Pickwirt never replied. The fate of the trunk. The survival of Pickwirt's journals is almost as improbable as the railway they describe. When he returned to France in 1929, he packed the 17 notebooks into a military-issue ammunition trunk, along with 3 rolls of maps, a rusted wrench, 2 train manifests signed but unused. The trunk remained sealed in his attic until 1998. Upon its discovery by his granddaughter's estate executor, it was nearly discarded, mistaken for scrap. Only A historian friend recognized the value of the hand-bound volumes. After limited publication and digital preservation, the journals were deposited in France's colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence. Since then, they've become a quiet treasure for historians of empire, not for what they explain, but for what they reveal by not trying to explain. A quiet man, a dying project, and a desert that didn't care. A monument made of paper. In 2017, a group of local artists and historians in Tamanrasset proposed a monument not to Pickford himself, but to the act of recording the unnoticed. The monument, eventually built in 2020, consists of a full-scale model of a deserted desert station room, open to the sky, an engraved excerpt from Pickford's journal, in Arabic and French. There is nothing here, and so I write everything. A sealed glass box containing a modern notebook, where visitors are invited to write their own observations, however trivial. It is visited rarely, mostly by school groups, but it stands as perhaps the most fitting tribute not to a man of ambition, but to a man who watched, recorded, and waited. Reflection: the value of small voices. Pickford did not resist empire. He did not challenge it, but neither did he celebrate it. His journals stand outside the grand narratives, free from pomp, free from moralizing. They are filled with bent nails, ration tallies, the sound of wind whistling through unused keyholes. And in those details, we see the truth of what colonial infrastructure often became: effort without direction, labor without reward, permanence without purpose. His voice is not loud, but it lingers. And now, after all these years, we find ourselves asking, how many other voices, quiet, careful, uncelebrated, are buried beneath our loud histories, waiting to be read? The final volumes of Lieutenant André Pickford's journals span from 1926 to 1929, the last years of his service in the Saharan Logistics Corps. By this point, his writing had become both more detailed and more detached. Gone were the hopeful notes about scheduling improvements or track expansion. Gone, too, were the repeated questions about whether trains would finally arrive on time. Instead, his words settled into a kind of meditative rhythm, much like the desert itself: repetitive, minimal, oddly profound. February 14, 1928. Today I cleaned the same lantern for the 27th time. It has not been lit in 8 months. I keep it polished out of habit. I wonder now if habit is the only thing keeping this railway standing. A rail line held together by routine. By 1928, the station where Pickford was assigned had become what he called a stable ruin. The buildings were intact, but hollow. Trains passed irregularly, 2 per month, sometimes fewer. The track suffered from misalignments due to sand drifts, and minor derailments were common. Pickford was no longer in charge of managing supply chains or overseeing crews. Instead, he became something closer to a caretaker of emptiness, inspecting unused warehouses, counting unused tools, noting how each season wore slightly more away from the walls and windows. In one of his final notebooks, he recorded the daily rate of dust accumulation on a desk he never used. March 3, 1928. I measured 2 millimeters of dust today, the same as last week. I am strangely comforted by the consistency. It was around this time that he began to refer to the entire railway as a gesture, not an act of transportation, not a plan, simply a gesture, a motion made once long ago that had never quite been retracted. The mirage of connection. Pickford often returned to the central idea that the railway had been intended to connect. And yet, in nearly a decade, he had witnessed very little actual connection take place. The line did not unify regions. It did not bring prosperity. It served no towns of consequence, passed through no centers of trade. When trains did run, they often carried more sand than cargo, more apologies than passengers. July 8, 1928. The railway is a line drawn across a map of silence. We meant to bridge spaces. Instead, we marked the void. His journals increasingly question whether the desert had simply absorbed the railway, turned it into one more path for wind and time to travel. August 2, 1928. There are no echoes here. The desert eats sound. I shouted yesterday just to test the theory. Only the goats reacted. A portrait of imperial absurdity. While never political, Pickwart's writings drifted toward a subtle critique, not through rhetoric, but through repetition. He described in exhausting detail the pointless maintenance of things no longer in use. Repainting direction signs in locations where no one passed. Inspecting empty fuel drums for leakage. Testing telegraph lines that hadn't transmitted a message in years. October 20, 1928. We received replacement glass for windows that are still broken. No one knows who requested them. They came with 3 cases of dried anchovies and no instructions. This absurdity wasn't unique to the railway. It reflected the broader bureaucratic machinery of empire, where appearances mattered more than outcomes. Pickwick was one cog among many, turning slowly in a machine that had already outlived its justification. And he knew it. December 11, 1928. The trains come less often now, but the forms still come. The papers still require numbers. I send them. I invent them sometimes. It makes no difference. The final pages. The last notebook ends in the spring of 1929. Pickwart's final entries are spare, poetic, and strangely peaceful. April 3, 1929. I have stopped expecting the train. Now I listen for it the way one listens for rain. April 18, 1929. I am packing. The trunk is heavier than I remember, sand in every page. I will take it all, though I do not know who will care. April 21, 1929. I leave tomorrow. I will miss the silence. It told me things that orders never did. He returned to France and never served in Africa again. His journals remained sealed for nearly 70 years. The legacy of a minor man. André Pickwick died in 1964 at the age of 73. There was no obituary, no military honor. His trunk remained untouched until the late 1990s. But today, he is remembered by a small circle of historians as the author of one of the most granular, human-scale accounts of colonial infrastructure ever recorded. He is not studied for his insights, but for his persistence in noticing, his refusal to let boredom, irrelevance, or emptiness stop him from writing. The Trans-Saharan Railway failed, but Pickwick succeeded in preserving how it failed. Not dramatically, not tragically, but quietly, day by dusty day. Reflection, the value of watching. In a world obsessed with results, Pickwick gave us process. He watched a system unravel in slow motion and kept count, not to fix it, not to resist it, simply to witness it. His journals are not thrilling, they are filled with weather notes, shipment miscounts, bent nails, empty chairs. But within that mundanity is the essence of history, the accumulation of what was really there, not what was supposed to be. In the words of one scholar, Pickwick recorded failure without resentment. He turned tedium into testimony. And so the journals end. No grand revelation, no collapse, no victory, just a man who wrote until there was nothing left to write. But perhaps that, too, is worth remembering. After all, how much of our history has been shaped not by explosions or revolutions, but by quiet men in forgotten stations, writing what they see. Story 4, Mail Sacks in Mirage, the postal routes of the Sahara. The desert is not a place that lends itself to certainty. Distances are distorted by heat. Time stretches between sunrises. Tracks vanish in storms. And yet, for over half a century, a network of couriers, camels, trains, and later trucks attempted something deeply ambitious, a regular postal service across the Sahara. It was known in official French documents as the Service Postal Saharian, but to those who relied on it or tried to run it, it was simply the line of letters, a thin, wavering promise of communication across hundreds of miles of sand. This is the story of the post routes that tried to cross the world's greatest desert, where every delivery was a minor miracle, and where even lost mail carried the weight of memory. Before the railway, the age of the camel courier. Long before the French built rails or drew maps, messages traveled by camel. The Tuareg and Moorish traders, who knew the desert intimately, served as the earliest couriers. They moved goods, stories, and letters between oasis towns, using memory and stars to navigate. These couriers did not follow fixed timetables. Their routes were oral traditions, handed down, adjusted based on season, tribe, and treaty. A letter could take weeks or months to arrive or disappear entirely. When the French began their colonization of Algeria and West Africa in the 19th century, they encountered this system and immediately mistrusted it. Oral routes could not be audited. Timetables could not be enforced. And so, beginning in the 1880s, the French began to formalize the mail. They built waypoints, hired guides, and set up postal contracts with camel caravans. By 1901, the first official Algiers Gao postal line was conceived without tracks, without telegraph lines, just leather mail sacks lashed to animals in the sand. The desert, one French inspector noted in 1903, does not recognize the envelope, but we shall insist. The mail as a symbol. To the French colonial project, post was more than communication. It was an emblem of control. Letters moving regularly across the Sahara were proof of empire, a visible sign that France could tame even silence. And so, even when it made little economic or logistical sense, the postal routes were maintained. Crews were dispatched monthly. Some lines were absurdly long. Taugert to Tamanrasset, 1,200 km, 20-30 days by camel. Ouagle to Gao, 2,000 km, 5-8 weeks depending on weather. Fort Flatters to Insala, 800 km, 10-15 days, often alone. Each camel carried food, water, a few spare parts, and a heavy leather satchel filled with mail wrapped in canvas and wax paper to protect it from sand and sweat. The role of the courier Saharian. The men who delivered this mail, both colonial and indigenous, were called couriers Saharians. They were part postman, part pathfinder, part survivalist. Their job was not just to deliver letters, but to know how not to die doing it. They were issued a short rifle, 2-3 flares, 2 compasses, a small stamped logbook for delivery records. But most important was their memory. Many courier routes had no visual markers. The courier had to know when to turn, when to veer from dune to wadi, when to rest a camel near water not visible on any map. "You do not see the way," one courier, Mahmoud Ben Tayyib, told a French officer in 1911. "You remember it." Delays, dangers, and disappearances. Despite the dedication of these couriers, mail was often delayed, very often, sometimes by months. Why? Sandstorms, flash floods, camel illness or theft, attacks by bandits, rebels, or wild animals. Simply getting lost. One route between Reggin and Adrar lost 6 camels in a single year to snakebite. Another route had a 40% mail delay, rate meaning more than a third of the letters took twice the expected delivery time. And then there were the disappearances. Every year 1-2 courier Saharians vanished, their mail never recovered. Some were later found, buried in sand, still strapped to their saddles. Others were never found at all. One such man, Sergeant Henry Duplessis, vanished in 1927 along the Thames-roofed crossing. His last recorded words, written in his delivery log, were, The wind is against us. I will wait for the moon. He never arrived. His logbook was discovered by a Tuareg herder 11 years later, 75 kilometers off course. The letters were unopened. From camel to engine. In the 1920s, as portions of the Trans-Saharan Railway were slowly built, mail was shifted where possible to rail transport. This was faster and more reliable, but only for the northern segments. From Biskra to Ouagla and later to Hassi Messaoud, mail could now be delivered in days instead of weeks. This transformed life in desert garrisons and towns. Officers received family updates. Merchants placed orders. Administrators sent reports. But the line still ended far short of the Niger River or the deeper Sahara. South of the tracks, the camels reigned. The hybrid system that emerged was complicated. Mail left Algiers by train, reached Taugerd, was transferred to camel by hand, passed to local guides, then, if lucky, delivered to a wooden box in a sun-beaten outpost. A letter from Paris to Timbuktu in 1935 took, on average, 59 days. The mirage of regularity. Colonial officials continued to insist on postal regularity. Reports were filled with language like monthly cadence and mission-critical deliveries. But the desert had its own schedule. To enforce discipline, couriers were sometimes punished for delays, even when they had survived sandstorms or attacks. One 1932 record shows a courier receiving 5 days confinement for a 12-day delay, despite having lost 2 camels and nearly dying of dehydration. A sympathetic officer scribbled in the margin. He arrived with frostbitten hands and 2 dead goats. Perhaps the mail was not his first concern. What did these letters say? Very few of the letters themselves survive. Most were mundane, official reports, requests for supplies, personal letters home. But a handful remain either lost and recovered or archived by collectors. They include a marriage proposal mailed from a drawer to Marseille, carried by 3 different camels and a train. A child's drawing sent from Tamanrasset, addressed only to Papa in the north. A letter from a railway engineer in 1925 complaining of boredom. The mail is late again. I cannot recall if the last one was the 2nd or 3rd of the month. Perhaps it does not matter. One letter, sent in 1928 from an officer to his wife, reads, "If this reaches you, it means I am alive. If it does not, I hope someone will have told you." But what happened to the Service Postal Saharian after the fall of the colonial project? Did the line of letters continue, or did the wind, at last, carry it away? In the 1930s and 1940s, the Saharan postal routes existed in a paradoxical state, failing yet operational, fragile yet determined. Like so much of the French colonial effort in the Sahara, the mail system was not sustained by practicality, but by persistence. It continued not because it worked, but because to stop would admit defeat. And so the desert mail lines endured. Through wars, droughts, and revolts, each letter carried through 1,000 miles of silence, each delivery a small act of institutional faith. The role of the relay stations. To manage the long and dangerous journeys, the Service Postal Saharian created relay stations every 100 to 150 kilometers along the more traveled postal corridors. These were not full outposts, often just a well, a wall, and a Linta hut, but they offered couriers essential things. Water, shade, a place to leave messages if the route had changed. Occasionally, another human being. At many of these stops, a cache de secours, an emergency box, was buried beneath marked stones. These caches contained basic food, matches, bandages, and sometimes a replacement compass. Couriers were trained to look for the signs. A cluster of stones in a V shape meant a cache was nearby. It might save a life. One surviving note, Written in chalk on the wall of a relay station near Tinzayutin, read: "If you are reading this, wait one night. I left north at dusk. Water is behind the dune." No signature, no date. The war years, mail amid conflict. With the outbreak of World War II, the Sahara became more than a remote outpost. It became a corridor for military intelligence, supply lines, and political uncertainty. The mail system became a strategic asset, even as it fell into deeper disrepair. The couriers were still largely indigenous men, many of whom had no formal allegiance to either Vichy or Free French forces. Yet they continued to deliver letters, some marked official, others personal without question. In one notable case from 1942, a courier named Ali Ben Salah reportedly carried a sealed diplomatic pouch from Tamanrasset to Gao, traveling over 2,000 kilometers in 41 days. He crossed multiple conflict zones, slept in dry wadis, and lost one camel. The pouch contained a request for additional boots. Boots? Still, he was awarded a citation for dedication. The boots never arrived. When the truck replaced the camel. By the late 1940s, the Service Postal Saharian began to slowly mechanize. Military surplus trucks Burliet GBCs and Dodge WC models were repurposed for long-haul desert delivery. These were unreliable, underpowered for dunes, and required constant repair. But they were faster. The system became hybridized. Trucks handled mail between larger towns, Bachar, Tamanrasset, and Salah. Camels continued to handle the final legs, particularly where no roads existed. Rail supported the few northern stretches that still operated. This change brought mixed results. In some regions, mail speed improved. In others, trucks broke down more often than camels fell ill. Mechanical problems were frequent, spare parts rare. One driver, quoted in a 1951 maintenance report, remarked, "The desert does not like gears, it prefers hooves." Still, the trucks came to symbolize progress. Their engines echoed in places once used to only hoofbeats and silence. French propaganda posters from this era featured proud postmen posing beside sand-caked vehicles, holding envelopes as if they were medals. Delays by policy. As the war ended and colonial power began to shift, another kind of delay began to impact the mail: bureaucratic interference. Letters were held for inspection. Delivery logs were cross-checked against increasingly outdated maps. Some routes were deprioritized due to cost, meaning mail might sit in a crate for weeks before someone decided it was worth delivering. Letters with addresses like "To my brother," near the well outside Amgwid, were labeled undeliverable, even though local couriers knew exactly where to go. In 1954, one frustrated mail clerk scrawled in the corner of a postal manifest, "We sort letters to nowhere, but still we sort them." Mail for the missing. One of the more tragic dimensions of the Saharan postal system was the number of letters that were never claimed. At remote outposts, particularly railway stations and military camps, mail would arrive for people who had long since departed, been reassigned, or died. There were no return addresses, no system to forward mail, and so it sat in rusting tin boxes or on shelves in locked rooms. By 1955, colonial reports listed over 2,000 undelivered letters stored in Saharan postal offices. Some had been there for over a decade. The postmarks faded, the paper yellowed. A few examples from surviving archives. A birthday card for a child, postmarked 1947, unopened, the envelope sealed with wax. A letter addressed to Madame Roussel, Fort Polignac, with no known recipient. A folded note, water-damaged, containing only the words, "I forgive you." Voices across the void. Despite its absurdities, failures, and losses, the Saharan postal system mattered. To families separated by thousands of miles. to officers trying to hold together remote units, to traders and townspeople awaiting supplies, to people who simply needed to know someone remembered them. In a world with no phones, no radio for most, and no guarantee of return, a letter was more than paper. It was proof of life, a thread across a desert that tried every day to erase the human trace. Even if the letter never came, wrote one colonist in 1956. We waited for it, because the waiting meant we were still part of something. When the letters stopped, as Algeria's War of Independence began in 1954 and escalated throughout the decade, the Saharan mail routes deteriorated. Attacks on convoys increased. Couriers were caught between conflicting factions. Some joined the resistance, others simply disappeared. Official postal operations became sporadic, then irregular, then non-existent. By 1962, the Service Postal Saharian was formally disbanded. Mailboxes were removed or sealed. Relay stations abandoned. Records lost, burned, or locked away in French archives. The desert was quiet again. But did all the letters disappear? Were all those voices silenced, or did something remain? By the early 1960s, the postal routes of the Sahara had faded like ink in the sun. What began as a colonial experiment in communication had become a ghost network of empty mailbags, shuttered depots, and letters never claimed. And yet the desert has a long memory. While the official Service Postal Saharian was dismantled and forgotten by administrative powers, fragments of its letters, ledgers, stories remained, not just in archives, but in villages, memory, and sand. Even now, traces of this long-defunct system still surface, carried on wind and rumor, like the last pages of a book that refuses to close. Desert archives, where the mail ended up. In a drawer, a local librarian named Abdelkader Nur began collecting old paper artifacts in the 1980s. His collection included ration tickets from 1939, water usage logs from desert garrisons, letters with missing addresses, torn fragments of mailbags marked post-militaire, Sahara. Most of the items came not from archives, but from markets where they were sold as scrap, wrapping, or fire-starting material. Some came from families who found old bundles buried in crates, left behind by officers or administrators fleeing during Algeria's war for independence. Among his discoveries, a set of 41 letters, all from 1952, all addressed to a Madame El Chevalier, posted from 5 different Saharan outposts. None had been opened. The letters were tender, filled with longing, daily details, and promises to return soon. A single envelope addressed only Amon Fils, Labas, to my son out there. Inside, a photo of a child and no written message. Nur created a small exhibit titled, Messages Without Arrival. He explained, even unclaimed mail has meaning. These are not failed letters, they are waiting letters. Tuareg memory and oral post. In communities untouched by rail or road, a parallel tradition kept postal memory alive, oral delivery. Among the Tuareg, stories tell of messengers who remembered not only the contents of letters, but their tone, their urgency, and their context. One Tuareg elder, Akil Ag Mohammed, interviewed in 1995 near Tamanrasset, recalled, "We had men who could carry 10 letters in their heads, one for a father, one for a son, one for a debt, one for a birth. Each one spoken with the right words. That was how it worked. You trusted the man, not the paper." These verbal letters were often more reliable than the written ones, especially in the most remote areas, where no official mail ever reached. When asked about the collapse of the Postal Service, Akil shrugged. It was never our service. The desert always had its own way of speaking. Reused, repurposed, remembered. The infrastructure of the colonial postal system, did not vanish, it was repurposed. Relay huts became storage buildings or homes. Rusting mailboxes were turned into cupboards or birdhouses. Old stamps were used to decorate wedding invitations. The wooden crates used to deliver letters were broken down and burned as firewood. One Saharan village still uses an old French postal desk as the imam's table at the local mosque. Another outpost displays a cracked sign reading Post-Saharan, Alert du Courier, above a modern solar panel. Even discarded mailbags once sewn from thick canvas and stamped with dates were turned into satchels, water carriers, or sleeping mats. The end of waiting. Perhaps the most painful legacy of the Sahara mail routes was the habit of waiting. Many families learned to expect mail that never came. Children waited for word from fathers who had vanished into the war. Wives waited for updates from husbands who had transferred or died. Young men waited for acceptance letters to schools that never arrived. And so, over time, people stopped waiting. One woman, Fatima Jawadi, whose father worked as a postal clerk in the 1940s, described the moment she stopped checking the box. It wasn't sadness. It was like forgetting to wind a clock. One day you look up and the silence isn't strange anymore. For many, the disappearance of the post felt like closure by erosion. No announcement, no final delivery, just fewer letters, then none. Letters in museums. A few surviving letters now live in museums. The Musée Postal in Paris holds a collection of desert mail bags, with samples of postmarks from Fort Flatters, Tamanrasset, and Ouagla. The Museum of the Sahara in Algiers preserves several unopened letters as exhibits, including one with the haunting address. To the man who watches the tracks. Visitors pass these displays quickly, rarely reading the full contents, but historians see them differently, as time capsules of intent, evidence of communication, even when delivery failed. One curator put it this way: a letter written and never received is still a human act. It's the sending that matters. The final delivery. In 2007, a group of amateur historians and postal workers in Algeria undertook an unusual project. They located 53 surviving letters addressed to people who had never received them, most undelivered from the 1940s and 50s. Using voter rolls, oral interviews, and travel, they attempted to deliver the letters, or at least return them to the families of the senders or intended recipients. They succeeded in 16 cases. In one, a 70-year-old woman received a letter her father had written when she was 5. He had died in 1956. She read it in silence, then folded it and said, "He wrote it, I heard it, that's enough." Reflections: when a system becomes a symbol. The Saharan postal system was never efficient. It was never profitable. It was rarely even reliable. But it was symbolic, a way of saying, you are not alone. Your voice can travel. A piece of you can reach the other side of the sand. Even when the letters didn't arrive, people believed in them. Believed in the man walking across the dunes with a sack of paper and the courage to keep going. And that belief lingered, long after the train stopped running, long after the war ended, long after the colonial offices closed. The desert's answer. So what happens to letters that never arrive? Do they vanish, or do they simply change form? In the Sahara, perhaps, they return to the wind, a spoken name, a whispered apology, a sentence remembered long after the envelope was lost. In a landscape that forgets everything, the act of trying to remember, of writing, sealing, sending, is a defiance of silence. And so, even now, in scattered villages and among sand-worn ruins, some still say, "The post might come, it did once." Story 5. The Forgotten Surveyor, Auguste Choisy's Dusty Blueprints. The desert is a place that resists borders. It shifts. It erodes. It refuses to stay where you place it on a map. Yet in the early 20th century, a French architect and surveyor named Auguste Choisy attempted something radical, to draw the Sahara not just as terrain, but as a structure. He believed the desert could be measured, rationalized, and ultimately connected by rail. His weapon was not a compass, but a T-square, and his legacy was not tracks, but blueprints. Forgotten in a file drawer for decades, Choisy's meticulous, almost obsessive diagrams of the Trans-Saharan project became one of the most thorough and impractical design archives in colonial history. This is the story of plans that were too precise for a land that never held still. The architect of theoretical lines. Auguste Choisy was not an adventurer. He never rode a camel. He did not speak Arabic. He preferred paper to people and spent most of his time in a dusty office at the École des Ponts et Chaussées in Paris, surrounded by stacks of tracing paper and metal rulers. Trained as both an architect and engineer, he was initially known for his studies of Roman construction and early Gothic geometry. But in 1907, Choisy was assigned to the Colonial Railway Office, where he was asked to assist with structural planning for desert installations. In practice, this meant designing railway buildings, bridges, and infrastructure that might never be built. He treated the assignment as a kind of sacred geometry project. "Even the desert," he once wrote, "has proportions. One must simply listen to them carefully." A cathedral of drawings. Between 1908 and 1923, Choisy produced over 600 technical drawings related to the Trans-Saharan Railway. These included station designs for climates with no dependable shade, engine depots with removable walls for seasonal airflow, blueprints for bridges that would span dry riverbeds with water-resistant pilings just in case, sleeping quarters for workers aligned with prevailing wind patterns so that sand would accumulate away from entrances, signal towers that could be assembled by 6 men using no heavy equipment. None of these designs were requested. Many were far too complex to build in the field, but they were beautiful, layered with details, inscriptions, and explanatory notes in Choisy's slanted, fussy handwriting. A typical drawing might feature a plan view, a cross-section, elevation diagrams for summer and winter shadow casting, annotations like, "If water is found nearby, insert drainage channel here." These were not construction documents. They were propositions, a way of asking what might be possible if only the desert were slightly more cooperative. The geometric line fallacy. One of Choisy's most controversial contributions was his support for a geometric alignment principle, the idea that railways through the desert should follow the straightest line possible, regardless of obstacles. In his 1910 memo, L'Axe du Désert, he argued, "Curves are for countries with hills and people. In the Sahara, the line must reflect the idea of dominion. Let it be straight. Let it be seen from far." This philosophy led to early rail alignments being drawn as unbroken chords, even through dunes, salt flats, and seasonal wadis. Engineers in the field, those who had to actually build the tracks, objected vehemently. They begged for curvature, for avoidance, for adaptation. But Choisy's influence in Paris was considerable, and so the theoretical line persisted long after it had proven unworkable. "He built with a ruler," one colonial engineer later wrote, "but we built with shovels." A designer without a sight. What makes Choisy's work remarkable and tragic is that almost none of it was ever built. A few of his station designs were used in modified form. A small shed near Ouagle bears resemblance to his Desert Type C outpost. But mostly, his work remained on paper. He worked from climate charts and sketch maps. He requested soil samples but never saw them. He corresponded with officers in the field, who sent him photos of wind-blasted huts and collapsing depots, to which he would respond with polite advice about anchoring techniques and overhang dimensions. He once sent a 16-page manual on the ideal desert window shutter to a railway camp with no windows. Yet he remained convinced that the problem was not his designs, it was the land's refusal to accommodate them. A binder forgotten in a drawer. In 1925, Choisy retired. His designs were boxed, labeled Projet Trans-Saharien Plans Préliminaires, and shelved in a government archive in Algiers. They were never officially published. They were never formally cancelled. They were simply filed and ignored. The desert, as always, had moved on. Rediscovery in the dust. In 1982, during a routine archive consolidation in Algiers, a historian named Farid Lakhdari stumbled upon Choisy's designs. He had been searching for colonial railway photos, but instead found 17 oversized binders, each one yellowed but intact. He opened to a page titled Model de guerre, région de brume hypothétique. Station model, hypothetical fog region. There is no fog in the Central Sahara. Lakhdari would go on to write a short academic article titled Ligne sur Sable, the theoretical stations of Auguste Choisy, where he praised the aesthetic and structural brilliance of the designs, while acknowledging their complete detachment from reality. They were stations not for people, he wrote, but for principle, architecture as a kind of colonization of the imagination. The quiet irony of permanence. In the end, Choisy's work outlived much of the railway itself. The stations that were built crumbled, the tracks rusted or vanished, but his drawings protected in manila folders and acid-free boxes remained pristine, untouched by sand or sun. In 2009, a curated selection of his works was displayed at the Cité de l'Architecture in Paris, under the title Lines Across Silence, the Railway That Was Never Built. Visitors admired the elegant renderings, the symmetry, the fine annotations. Few realized that these drawings had nothing to do with function. They were architectural fiction, acts of faith in the idea that even the most shifting landscape could be made to conform. But did Choisy know? Did he understand that he was designing for a world that could not accept design? Was he complicit in colonial overreach, or simply another man, trying to leave straight lines behind in a land that preferred circles? By the late 1920s, Auguste Choisy's blueprints were quietly fading from memory. The desert continued its indifferent drift, ignoring the clean lines he had imposed from thousands of kilometers away. Trains struggled across sand-choked tracks. Stations crumbled or were never built at all. And Choisy, he kept drawing. Even after retirement, even after official interest in the Trans-Saharan Railway waned, Choisy continued to mail unsolicited updates to the colonial office. In each parcel, new versions of plans arrived, refinements, variations, alternate facades. None were acknowledged, none were used. He was designing now for permanence in absence. The private sketchbooks. Uncovered in 1999 among personal papers donated to a French architectural archive, Choisy's private sketchbooks, unlike his formal blueprints, reveal a more philosophical mind at work. They are filled not only with technical renderings, but also essays on geometry in barren spaces, observations on shadows in open terrain, musings on stationness, the essential qualities that make a place feel like it has a destination. One entry reads, "In the desert, a building without purpose is not a failure. It is a shelter, and shelter by its very existence becomes purpose." Another, "A drawing must outlast the structure it proposes. In this way, it becomes architecture." These notebooks show that Choisy's obsession with order was not only technical, it was existential. His belief in measured space, in proportion, in the rationality of design, was a way of resisting the disorder of empire, the chaos of wind and policy. Where others saw collapse, he saw the opportunity to draw again more clearly. the Choisy School of Desert Design. Though never a movement in any formal sense, Choisy's influence can be traced through a quiet lineage of desert architects and planners in North Africa and the Middle East. His ideas about passive cooling through wind alignment, minimal material profiles, modular construction suited for isolated zones, all resurfaced in the mid-20th century, often divorced from his name, but rooted in his drawings. In 1954, an Algerian engineering student named Youssef Nasseri wrote a thesis on desert structural rationalism, which borrowed heavily, often word for word, from Choisy's sketchbook annotations. When asked about the source, Nasseri replied, "They were notes I found in a forgotten drawer. The handwriting was precise. That was enough for me." The blueprint as narrative. What makes Choisy's archive so unusual is that it functions not merely as a design resource, but as a narrative of belief. Each iteration of his plan suggests a confidence in future use, a sense that someone someday will need a signal tower here, a maintenance shed there, that progress once mapped will manifest. This was not arrogance, it was a kind of ritual optimism. To place a door on paper, Choisy wrote, is to admit the possibility that someone might enter. And so he placed hundreds of doors. They appear in every station, every outbuilding. Some lead to nowhere, some open inward, but each one is drawn with hinges, locks, dimensions, even the swing radius. In a land where people often slept outside, beneath stars or canvas, Choisy designed perfect doors. The useless perfection. The central paradox of Choisy's work is this: the better his designs were, the less useful they became. Field engineers needed improvisation. They needed tolerance for error, flexibility, resilience. Choisy offered them. Perfect tolerances. Right angles that refused to bend. Load-bearing calculations down to the kilogram. A construction report from Taugert Station in 1930 notes, "We attempted to follow drawing 17C from Choisy's plans. The result was delayed by 6 weeks due to lack of fittings and inconsistent stone shape. His precision is inspiring, but unbuildable." And yet, even those who failed to use his designs admired them. Many kept copies for reference. Some pinned sections to the walls of desert offices not as guides, but as symbols of what clarity might look like in a landscape of confusion. Choisy's final years. Auguste Choisy died in 1934 in a modest Paris apartment with no titles or major commissions to his name. He had published extensively in his early life, but the Trans-Saharan project marked the end of his professional recognition. He left no heirs. His estate, consisting mainly of books and drafting tools, was donated to the École des Beaux-Arts, where it sat unexamined for decades. His obituary in Le Figaro made no mention of the railway. And yet, his archive remains one of the most complete visual records of a project that mostly never existed. The reemergence of the plans. In 2011, a multidisciplinary design symposium in Marseille featured a panel titled "Drawing the Impossible: Forgotten Visions of Colonial Infrastructure." Choisy's plans were the centerpiece. Architects, historians, and philosophers debated whether his work represented visionary genius, pointless perfectionism, or quiet resistance to imperial haste. One speaker suggested Choisy was not building for the empire, he was building for the blueprint itself. Another countered, but he was the empire, its hand, its ruler, its attempt to make the world behave. Whatever the truth, the drawings sparked conversation. Some were reprinted in academic journals. Others were reinterpreted by modern designers, creating modular emergency shelters for refugee camp structures requiring speed, shade, and symmetry. It turns out Choisy's designs, intended for a railway that failed, found new life in humanitarian crises, places that, like the desert, resist order and yet demand shelter. A line on a map, a line in the mind. So what do we make of Choisy's legacy? He never stood on the sands of the Sahara. He never saw the tracks laid or bent under sun. But he left behind a map of what might have been not just in geography, but in thought. His lines were hopeful. His measurements were faithful. His doors were always drawn open. In the end, he wasn't building a railway. He was building a record of intent. And sometimes that is enough. In a world that often forgets those who plan rather than build, August Choisy's quiet rebellion lies in the endurance of the draft. His structures never cast shadows. His stations never whistled with the arrival of trains, but his lines remained inked, copied, studied. And as the years passed, long after the colonial dreams of a railway vanished into the sand, the blueprints waited. Not for construction, but for understanding. A strange legacy of absence. In the Ministry of Transport archives in Algiers, an aging folder labeled Plans Non-Rail Essays, Project Trans-Saharan, contains a series of documents dated between 1922 and 1932. Most are bureaucratic rejections, marked with stamps like Inadéquat au terrain, Coût prohibitif, Hors mission actuelle. But in several margins, someone has scribbled comments in pencil and with surprising affection. Very clean. An elegant solution. Should be used elsewhere. These brief notes reflect a truth that emerged slowly over time. Choisy's designs were never wrong, they were simply misplaced. As Algeria's independence movement gathered force in the 1950s, the relevance of such colonial design files diminished. Yet a handful of Algerian architects in the 1970s rediscovered them, not as blueprints for empire, but as case studies in resilience. One called them designs for a future that hadn't yet chosen a direction. The anti-monument. In modern architectural history, Choisy's Trans-Saharan project has come to represent a rare genre of artifact, the anti-monument. Rather than commemorating victory or achievement, his work stands as a monument to a failure to impose structure, the futility of mastering vastness, the belief that if one draws carefully enough, control might follow. Yet there is something noble in that attempt. Not arrogance but discipline. Not ignorance but persistence. Not hubris but hope. In the desert, where nothing stays in place, Choisy's unbuilt stations offered the fantasy of anchoring. Echoes in unexpected places. Though never executed in full, Choisy's design principles continue to echo subtly across architectural fields. In Namibia, shelters for desert researchers borrow his ventilation louvers. In Mauritania, rest stops along the Nouadhibou. Zouarat Railway mimic the layout of Choisy's Desert Shelter Type B. In Timbuktu, an NGO repurposed his open-air waiting room structure for a public clinic. His focus on repetition, modularity, airflow, and solar exposure, once deemed too meticulous, has become valuable in an era that prizes passive design and climate-conscious architecture. Where once he was ignored for being impractical, Choisy is now admired for being a century early. The problem with straight lines. Perhaps the most philosophical question in Choisy's legacy is this. Why did he insist on straight lines? The desert teaches curves, dunes move in arcs, roads veer, life adapts, but Choisy's lines were severe, unwavering rail segments like arrows across maps. Some critics say he was trying to dominate nature. Others suggest he was trying to protect order in a world losing its center. His defenders argue that the lines were never literal. They were metaphors for vision, for reach, for the human need to draw meaning even where none exists. One modern architect described Choisy's blueprints as sacred geometry for a secular empire. when the wind erases. In 2015, a small group of artists and architects recreated one of Choisy's minor outpost designs near Elmenia, using only reclaimed materials and no machinery. They followed his original elevations and orientations exactly. The result was a haunting shell of a building, open on three sides, roofed with sheet metal, and placed along what had once been considered a future railway path. They left it unnamed, unsigned. Within 2 years, it had partially collapsed. But before it did, a photographer documented it in various stages of erosion. These photos were later displayed at the Venice Biennale under the title, "What the Wind Does to Blueprints." The final sketch. The last known drawing Choisy produced, found in the margins of a letter to a colleague, shows a single bench, beneath a slatted awning, casting striped shadows onto what appears to be packed earth. There are no trains, no buildings, no people. Only a place to sit. Facing west. A line to the evening wind. Below it he wrote one sentence. This too is a station. Reflection, a map of hope. August Choisy was not a builder of monuments, but of possibilities. His work endures not in iron and stone, but in the integrity of preparation, in believing that somewhere, someone might need a place to rest, a structure to shield, a plan to follow. He tried to bring clarity to a place that rewards adaptability. He failed in execution, but succeeded in capturing a moment of belief that design could matter, even when it is ignored. And that belief even now persists. In blueprints, in sketches, in the open air. A quiet record of where the ruler ends and imagination begins. Story 6, Rust and Regret, the colonial airfields of the empty quarter. In the farthest reaches of the Arabian desert, where the dunes stretch like frozen waves and the wind carries only the weight of silence, there once stood airfields, lonely outposts of ambition carved from the dust. They were built not for war nor peace, but for possibility. Scattered across the Rub al-Khali, or the empty quarter, these landing strips represented a colonial-era experiment in aerial infrastructure, a network designed to tame distance, to shrink the map, and to connect the unconnectable. Today, little remains of them but rippled concrete, rusting fuel drums, and sand-claimed bunkers. But once, they were beacons of forward-thinking failure. This is the story of the airfields the world forgot to use. A grand illusion takes flight. In the 1920s and 30s, as the romance of aviation gripped colonial Europe, strategists began looking beyond rivers and rails. The desert, long considered impassable, was now viewed from above as a blank slate, ripe for overflight. It was the French and the British, locked in a competition of imperial reach, who led the push. With air routes under development from Cairo to Baghdad, from Khartoum to Aden, the logical next step seemed obvious. Why not cross the empty quarter by air? This vast stretch of Arabia, largely unmapped by Europeans, became the setting for a grand idea. A string of staging posts where airplanes could refuel, repair, and relay information across the sands. They called it the aerial corridor of the South. But it was never more than partially realized. Engineering nothingness. Unlike railways, which needed infrastructure across every mile, an air corridor required only points, short strips of compacted ground where planes could land. But even these points proved difficult. Between 1931 and 1937, over a dozen such desert airstrips were laid out. The most notable include al-Hisn, constructed by the British Air Ministry as a stopover between Muscat and Riyadh. Fort Zeta, a French-built outpost with a fuel depot, 600-meter runway and wind tower. Cab Abu Dhabi, a gravel-surfaced emergency field marked by canvas windsocks and empty oil drums. Each was built with materials transported hundreds of kilometers by camel or lorry. There were no roads, no local labor familiar with aviation needs, and no reliable weather data. To compact runways, engineers sometimes used hand-rolled barrels filled with sand and water. Others relied on livestock, driven in circles to press down the soil. It was engineering with hope, recalled a Royal Air Force officer in a 1952 interview. We'd land on the very dirt we were still measuring. The planes that came and didn't. These airfields were intended to serve a handful of biplanes and early monoplanes. The aircraft of the time, like the Vickers Valentia or the Podes 25, were relatively slow and prone to breakdowns. A short flight across open desert could become deadly if a sandstorm struck or a bearing failed. Thus, these fields were imagined as lifelines, stepping stones for imperial air power and diplomatic mail alike. But few planes ever used them. Reasons were many. Routes shifted due to political instability. Fuel supply chains were unreliable. Visibility was often poor, with dust reducing navigability. Most fields lacked radio beacons, making night landings suicidal. In one case, a French pilot mistook a shimmering salt flat for a prepared strip and crashed 12 kilometers off course. The landing was survivable. The walk back was not. People who waited for planes. At each site, a small staff, typically a combination of military overseers, contracted mechanics, and occasionally conscripted local guides, was stationed. Their jobs were simple in theory. Maintain the runway. Keep fuel drums shaded and sealed. Raise signal flags for visibility. Wait for a plane. Weeks passed between landings. Often no planes came at all. One British mechanic stationed at al-Hisn in 1936 kept a logbook. It lists sunrises noted for their color, days without wind, dead birds found near the fuel tank, and one cryptic entry: a shadow crossed the ground today. I looked up too late to see what cast it. At Fort Zeta, staff built a sundial and played chess with pebbles. They sent status reports via camel courier only to discover, months later, that their mail was never retrieved. Sand as saboteur. Of all the airfield's enemies, sand was the most consistent and insidious. It blew into engines. It scoured the canvas skins of aircraft. It filled the gaps in fuel tanks. It buried the very runways meant to receive planes. Runway maintenance became a full-time battle. Teams laid out tarps and canvas nets to try and prevent dune encroachment. Some even applied crude oil to the runway surface, a method which briefly worked, but poisoned the soil and killed nearby vegetation. One French officer summed it up: "We did not build airfields. We built invitations for the desert to respond." And the desert always answered. The mirage of purpose. Perhaps the strangest aspect of these airfields was their liminal status, neither fully operational nor fully abandoned. They existed in a bureaucratic gray zone, often unlisted on official maps, but still receiving supplies, budgets, and personnel. Colonial governments feared that removing them would signal weakness to rivals, encourage local independence, or simply be too expensive to reverse. So they remained, manned, maintained, unvisited, like candles lit for guests who never arrive. The archaeology of isolation. Today, remnants of these outposts are slowly being studied by archaeologists and desert historians. At some sites, rusted propeller blades, fragments of radio masts, and even canteens stamped with regimental crests have been uncovered. What's striking is the uniformity of decay. All buildings align north-south to account for wind. All doorframes missing, taken by scavengers or swallowed by time. All runways indistinguishable from the surrounding flatness, only visible by drone, casting their ghostly outlines across pale sand. At Cobb, Abu Dhabi, researchers found a steel drum buried nearly a meter beneath the surface. Inside, perfectly preserved. A faded map. A logbook. A tin of sardines unopened. The last entry in the logbook read, March 14, no planes in 26 days, still here. The silence that remains. What do these airfields mean, now that no wheels touch their ground? They are not sites of triumph. They are not markers of connection. They are memories of misplaced certainty of an era when the future was expected to land, on time, with polished wings. And when it didn't, these places didn't erupt in drama. They simply faded, quietly, slowly, without ceremony. The runways remain barely, waiting not for planes, but for memory. The imperial vision for the airfields in the empty quarter was simple: establish a network, and the skis would follow. But after the brief and hesitant attempts of the 1930s and 40s, what followed was not an expansion of air travel, but a deep and creeping silence. The planes stopped coming, the outposts lingered. By the 1950s, most of the colonial governments that built these desert stations had shifted focus. The Second World War had rerouted the flow of resources and reshaped the ambitions of empire. Yet the airfields remained officially open, manned by skeleton crews and forgotten in layers of overlapping bureaucracy. Now they served a new purpose. Not transit, not conquest, but something quieter, stranger, a theater of patience. When a post goes nowhere. At Fort Zeta, a 1953 government report noted the presence of 3 staff members, including 1 cook, awaiting aircraft or orders. No aircraft had landed since 1947. No new orders had been issued since 1951. They sent monthly reports anyway, typed on aging ribbon machines, copied by hand when ink ran out. The reports spoke of sand movement around the southern storage bay. Status of fuel drums, 12 sealed, 4 suspect, 3 empty. 1 visitor in May, a Bedouin herder asking for salt. The final line in one report read, morale adequate, reading same books again. The aerograms that never left. At al-Hissan, the tiny radio mast had failed years earlier. With no radio communication, the men stationed there reverted to writing aerograms, the thin, foldable letters designed for airmail hopping. They might one day be picked up by a passing aircraft. They addressed them to the Air Ministry, to families, even to fictional pilots. Some of the letters, found decades later, contained fragments of disjointed hope. We have marked the runway with whitewashed stones again. Visibility excellent. Any news from England? The cook has died. We buried him beside the hangar. His cat remains. We still maintain protocol in the event of unexpected arrival. These were not cries for help. They were formal, restrained, sometimes cheerful. In a place built for speed, slowness had become its own kind of service. What were they waiting for? The persistence of these stations, even long after their logistical value had vanished, raises a question that has haunted historians. Why weren't they simply abandoned? The answer, like the airfields themselves, is a mix of dust and doctrine. Bureaucratic inertia meant no one wanted to take responsibility for closure. Military thinking dictated that a maintained outpost was better than a vacuum. Political nerves feared that abandonment might signal retreat or embolden rivals. And finally, some in the air ministries believed a sudden need might arise, a conflict, a storm, a diplomatic emergency wherein these outposts would once again prove vital. So the runways were brushed, the drums inspected, the flagpoles kept upright. And the desert watched. Echoes from the skis. Occasionally, the stillness broke. In 1956, a Sudanese pilot flying a test route between Khartoum and Salalah reported sighting a signal fire near Fort Zeta. He circled twice. No clear runway markings. He did not land. Later inspection revealed someone had arranged rocks into a large X and set fire to a circle of brush standard emergency protocol for requesting a drop or landing. But no one was found at the site. The last official staff had been withdrawn 2 years earlier. No explanation ever emerged. Lessons written in sand. By the early 1960s, the last of the British and French personnel were quietly removed. Several outposts were handed over to newly independent governments. A few were taken over briefly by oil prospecting companies. Most were left to dissolve. But before they vanished, a handful of desert survival handbooks were published, drawing directly from the observations of those who had served on these sites. These guides advised on how to align canvas shelters with dune ridges for minimal wind abrasion, methods of marking runways with salt or crushed gypsum, the art of listening to sand to detect approaching weather, psychological strategies for long-term isolation. The irony was cruel. The stations had failed as aviation outposts, but succeeded as experiments in desert endurance. They became manuals for how to stay, not how to go. The flight that never came. One of the last symbolic events in this long history of abandonment was the planned commemorative flyover of the empty quarter in 1964. A joint Franco-British gesture, it aimed to retrace the old theoretical air corridor, touching down at 3 former sites. The plan was ambitious. It drew media attention. But one by one, the landing permissions fell through. Political unrest blocked access to key regions. Shifting sands had obscured all recognizable runway features. Weather turned foul during the narrow flight window. The event was canceled. No press release was issued. The idea faded, unmentioned in official logs. One of the pilots later remarked, "It was as if the desert wanted no reminders, as if it had made peace with silence." The modern landscape of forgetting. Today, few remember the airfields of the empty quarter. They are not marked on tourist maps. They are rarely studied in military history courses. And they appear only as faint, rectangular discolorations in satellite imagery ghost, runways barely distinguishable from natural formations. But in some remote areas, nomads still camp near the old fuel bunkers, drawn by the remaining concrete pads that catch rain or offer a flat place to rest. They tell vague stories of machines that once came from the sky, of white men who waited for years, and of stations that lit fires no one answered. One oral account includes this line: "They built a road for the sky, but the sky never passed through." The silence that speaks. There is something oddly comforting in the failure of these airfields. In a world obsessed with utility and return on investment, they stand as reminders that not all plans are fulfilled, and that sometimes entire systems are built on hope alone. They also speak to the human need for presence even in absence, to place a marker, a shelter, a strip of compacted soil and say, "We were here, we were ready." But ready for what? And does that readiness mean anything if the planes never come? In the decades following decolonization, the airfields of the empty quarter faded not through catastrophe, but through erosion of structures, of memory, of purpose. No wreckage, no conflict, no final broadcast. Just the quiet, persistent work of time and sand. The desert does not mourn. It simply resumes. But the marks left behind, those long, straight scars across otherwise untouched landscapes, are not quite gone. And in recent years, curiosity about these forgotten waypoints has returned. Not to revive them, but to understand why they were left behind. Rediscovery by drone and dust. In the early 2000s, as satellite imagery and drone mapping became widespread, researchers began scanning the empty quarter for non-natural alignments, grids, rectangles, and long linear features inconsistent with geology. Among the finds, a perfectly straight line of rusted fuel drums stretching 800 meters in Abu al-Jarf, a set of intersecting runways near the Saudi-Omani border with remnants of tarred gravel surfacing, a half-buried hangar foundation near Dhofar, barely distinguishable from a collapsed dune. None were labeled. All corresponded with archival references to airfields never officially mapped. These weren't military secrets, they were just forgotten. In some cases, local herders had long known of them, calling them names like McIntyre, Plain Place, or M. A. Macron letter 1E60 A. Macron R. Al-Shams, Sun Airport, but considered them ancient ruins, not modern artifacts. From blueprint to artifact. As interest grew, several expeditions were launched by desert historians and archaeologists, but instead of treasure they found cracked concrete poured with a recipe unsuited for desert curing, shards of bakelite from 1930s radio housings, windsocks buried beneath half a meter of sand. In a bunker at the old Cobb Abu Dhabi field, one team uncovered a steel locker containing a pilot's flight log, untouched since 1942, 2 maps folded into quarters and stiff with time, a porcelain teacup, chipped but intact. The log included weather notations, fuel tallies, and under the final entry, runway condition clear, no further instructions, no traffic expected. It was dated May 18, 1942. The desert had waited over 60 years to be read again. An accidental philosophy. To some, these remnants are just colonial detritus. To others, they represent a kind of philosophy in ruin. Modern scholar Dr. Tarek al-Mansouri, whose work on ephemeral infrastructure brought new attention to the subject, describes the desert airfields as acts of preparation rather than completion. They teach us that to build something which may never be used is not always waste, it can be a form of commitment. He likens them to altars, ritual constructions meant to receive something hoped for, not guaranteed. The men who maintained those stations weren't waiting for airplanes, he argues. They were waiting for affirmation that the world still needed them. Lessons from isolation. The psychological impact of these outposts has drawn interest from fields as varied as military ethics, architecture, and even space exploration. The airfields, endurance protocols operating without supply chains, communications, or schedules mirror anticipated challenges of Mars base operations. Their design simplicity, durability, and placement strategies have influenced disaster relief shelters and remote medical stations. And their quiet failure has become a cautionary tale for over-engineered ambition, where planning outpaces purpose. In an odd twist, failure has made them useful again, not for transit, but for reflection. Sites of stillness. In recent years, a few of the more intact locations have attracted artists, writers, and minimalist travelers. Not tourists, exactly, there's little to see but pilgrims of slowness. At Fort Zeta, a small plaque was anonymously installed in 2018. It reads, "This was once a place of waiting. No one came, but those who waited made it real." Similarly, a photographic series titled Stations of the Absent documents the airfields at dawn and dusk moments, when shadows briefly reveal the geometry buried beneath dust. The series toured galleries in Paris, Beirut, and Muscat, accompanied by sound recordings of ambient desert wind captured at each site. The exhibit was eerily popular. Viewers stood quietly, staring at images of runways that served no planes, listening to the sound of nothing happening. A legacy not written in flight. The irony is striking. Airfields built for motion now symbolize stillness. Places constructed for function have become monuments to patience. And the very traits that doomed them, remoteness, redundancy, irrelevance, now make them powerful symbols for a world grappling with impermanence and forgotten ambition. Their legacy is not measured in takeoffs or landings, but in the care taken to prepare a place that may never be used, the endurance of waiting with no certainty, the willingness to invest in presence, even when presence is ignored. Final reflection, the absence that endures. So what do these forgotten airfields tell us? They tell us that infrastructure can be an act of faith. That purpose is sometimes found not in use, but in the attempt. That even in the world's emptiest corners, someone once drew a line, marked a space, and whispered into the wind, "This is where it will happen. We are ready." And even if nothing happened, even if no plane ever came, the whisper remains, carried by wind, buried in sand, but not erased.